Hello, everybody. Thank you so much for joining us for today's London Java community event with Jamie. Tonight's event is sponsored by Sonotype. We're really grateful for their sponsorship, so thank you, Sonotype. Let me introduce myself for those of you who don't know me. My name is Abby. I work with the LJC and the other 15 plus communities, all of which are free and run by RecWorks. We are a tech recruitment company with a big difference. So as a recruitment company, obviously, we're always on the lookout for more clients, and some of our best clients have come from community members who have recommended RecWorks to their internal talent teams. So if you are hiring for a new team or you're working for a company that is, please do get in touch to find out what we can offer. Feel free to ping me a message on LinkedIn or Slack. My name is, as you see it on the screen, and we really look forward to working with you. So what's the difference, I hear you say? Well, also as a company, we believe that recruitment really can be a force for good in the industry beyond just placing people in jobs. We have a particular focus on learning, mentoring, and personal development, and that's where our communities and events come into play. If people want to learn and others want to teach, we are more than happy to connect you through our communities and events. We see this as giving back to those we've worked with in the past, but also paying it forward to those we hope to work with in the future. To date, we have run over 700 events for engineers and developers, students, graduates, and CTOs. We have run conferences, lightning talks, hackathons, all sorts. Earlier this year, we made our 4,000th introduction through our Meet a Mentor community. We are really excited about that and look forward to making our 5,000th introduction through that group. As I've already said, we love to give opportunities for people to connect, and this event is part of that. If you'd like to know more about any of our other communities, again, get in touch with myself, Barry, or Helen Lewis if you know her, and we can take it from there. The recording of today's session will be available for you on YouTube. I will put the link in the chat, along with the details of our next Java Live event, which is our next in-person event, which happens tomorrow with Carly Richmond and Graham Cook. Again, I'll put the link in the chat for you. If you have any questions while Jamie is speaking this evening, please do make a little note. There will be time for Q&A at the end, and we really look forward to seeing you at our future events as well. So with no further ado, over to you, Jamie.
Thank you very much, Abby, for the amazing introduction. Right, let me start by sharing my screen and then we can get started. Okay, like Abby said, if you do have any questions, just so it doesn't interrupt my flow, ask them at the end. This is the first time I'm going through this talk, so hopefully it won't be too long, but I tend to speak quite quickly anyway, so hopefully you'll be free for this evening at some point soon. So yes, what we're talking about today, so thank you all for being here. My name's Jamie Lee Coleman. I'm a developer advocate for Sonotype. A bit about myself, so kind of my journey into DevRel and advocacy. I started off at IBM. I've pretty much been there my whole career. Worked on mainframes and products for mainframes in the beginning, which was interesting coming from university. So I did that a little bit at the beginning. Then I moved into basically WebSphere, etc. Yes, I do have a base cap. That's actually from DevNexus. That was from a conference I did last March, I think. But yeah, so as an advocate, I do get to travel quite a lot, which is awesome. But yeah, so started off with WebSphere, worked in their containerization team. So we were the first product in IBM to be containerized, which was cool. Worked on automating all of that. Worked on DevOpsy stuff for a little bit. Worked on JVM stuff for a little bit. And then I decided I really like talking to people and teaching and educating people. So then I started to move into developer advocacy. I've been doing that for about 5 years at IBM, and a month ago on Thursday I joined Sonotype just because I kind of wanted to talk about you know, there's only so much you can say about Java runtimes, etc. So I wanted a new challenge and to talk about security a little bit. So it's a little bit about me. Now you've got my life story, everybody. Right, next slide. Okay, so secret life of Maven. So we're going to be talking a bit about Maven today. Not solely about Maven, but the main thing we're going to be talking about is Maven. So how do we start with Maven? Well, Maven really starts with you as a developer, as the user. So you would go to Google, you go to Stack Overflow, figure out what you're trying to do. That'll provide you with a library that can generally do it. Let's say log4j core. Then you go to Google, you'd find that in Maven repository. And then you would basically you'd end up with something like this. You would take that dependency, you stick that in your Maven POM file or your Gradle build file, etc. And ta-da! After you've started your build, all of this stuff will just appear for you, which is amazing. So a lot of people use Maven specifically for Java stuff, but it pretty much hosts anything that kind of works with a JVM these days and supports different build tools like Gradle and Gradle Kotlin, etc. So it's not just Java dependencies that are on there. There are lots and lots of other stuff there. And like I said, anything pretty much to do with a JVM. Now, there's a lot of people and a lot of stuff that a lot of people rely on other people's stuff nowadays. So you've probably seen this stat before that 90% of modern applications are using open source dependencies. I mean, and why wouldn't they not? Why would we code something that someone spent, months and months creating when it already exists and we can use their code? It just makes sense to share, or sharing is caring, as the saying goes. So essentially, we really, really rely on things like Maven or just kind of any of these repositories that store all this lovely open source code. Now, having a quick Google to see how many Maven POM files are out there, and lots of other stuff came up, as you can see. But Maven POM is like very, very heavily used. And I think this came from GitHub. But as you can see, the Maven POM file is very heavily used. So a lot of people are using Maven out there. And like I said, you basically get started and bada bing, you end up with your stuff, and then you can build your application and away you go. And all this stuff's free. It just comes down from the internet for you. So nice and simple. So that's basically, as most of you all probably know, that's how you kind of get started with Maven. So a bit of an outline of what I'm going to talk about today. First of all, what is Maven Central? Kind of what we have now with Maven Central. And basically how and why we need to evolve Maven Central. What are the problems that are coming into our space now that we need to take on board and we need to find out solutions for? And then I'm going to give you a little bit of homework. There's 3 parts of homework, if I can remember all 3 of them. 2 of they're nothing particularly difficult, but yeah, I'll give you 3 things to think about going away from here. And then at the end, like Abby said, some questions and answers. So Maven Central, it feels like it's been with us forever. It has been around a long time. Not quite this. I tried to find some stuff on what the old Maven Central website looked like, and this is kind of what came up. So not Maven, but Maven has been around a while. And it's thanks to these 2 chaps and some others that kind of got together and thought we need a better way to build software, especially using open source software. And open source, I think at this point, you're talking around 2003, 2004, started to become more and more popular. So Brian Fox, who is actually still the CTO at Sonatype, and Jason, and like I mentioned, a few others, came together to build what we now know as Maven. And a lot of people, we use this all around the world to build our Java applications. Now, in 2003, Maven became a thing, completely funded by public donations at this time. And then we move on to 2005, where Apache Maven project was moved over, was moved to a new home. And while the central repo stayed, and this was still funded by public donation. And I mean, in the beginning days, this was kind of the situation where it was Brian Fox running a server underneath his desk, basically powering Maven Central, so all us developers around the world could utilize what that provided. And even myself, I've used Maven my whole career. Even when I worked in the mainframe sector, we were still using Java. So I've been using Maven probably from the beginning of my career. And I had no idea that Maven was funded by Sonatype. So when I was working at IBM, an old mentor of mine joined Sonatype and said, "Hey, come over here and join us." So I liked some of the stuff they were doing, etc. And then realized, wow, these are the guys that actually run Maven Central. I'm not sure, but I don't know how I didn't know that. And you might ask, why would Maven do this? Because running Maven Central is not very cheap. It's very, very expensive. And I'll talk a little bit about why Sonatype do this. Now, originally, the architecture of Maven Central really did outgrow its origins. It really couldn't handle what was being consumed from Maven Central on a daily basis anymore. So Sonatype kind of rewrote the book, rewrote the architecture to make it nice and simple, nice and easy to get to basically build and maintain. And it is a very simple architecture, nothing crazy in here. Essentially, you kind of have 3 different users. You have, as you can see, your publishers, your repo users, and your search users. So a publisher will essentially, they will go in, they will publish an artifact. That will then go into Nexus repository. Now, Nexus repository is consequently what we sell at Sonatype. It's one of our big products. And how that came about is the guys that created Nexus repository created this open source thing. Thought, great, this works really, really well, but we don't have any money. So why don't we start selling, supported Nexus repository? And that's kind of some of the origins of where Sonatype began. So essentially Nexus repository, we've got some Jenkins stuff there doing builds for us, and very simple, again, very simple architecture. With your repo users, you're going through Fastly, and as the engineers like to tell me, they were using Fastly before it was fast, and the search users going to, I can't remember the technology, but all this is hosted on essentially AWS, and yeah, all very connected together, but again, nice, simple architecture. And of course, with any good architecture, there's an API. Yay. Generally not the easiest to use APIs. I haven't found many that are really easy to use, but there is lots of documentation on how to use the Central Repository API. Now, let's get into some crazy numbers about what Maven Central and I guess Sonatype serve up on a yearly basis. So basically, as of 6th of May 2022, there are currently 8.8 million different component versions stored in Maven Central. That's 27 terabytes, with approximately 79,000 namespaces, organization, and publishers. And you may not think that's a lot, but the next stat on the next slides will put this into perspective. So in 2021, developers around the world made more than 496 billion requests to Maven Central. So that's a crazy amount of requests going to this service that most people don't know it's being run by Sonatype. They just know it as a thing and they just use it. And it's a crazy stat. And these things do cost Sonatype quite a lot of money. And that's not slowing down. Open source usage is going up dramatically around the world. Yeah, I don't know why there was a little slump in December, probably because it's Christmas time or the holidays time, so everyone's putting less components in, probably because they don't want to break stuff for users around the world around this time of the year. But as you can see from this graph, that the amount of usage of open source is kind of always going up. Now, it's not just Java that this is the case. So look at this, for example, the blue is projects that were available prior to 2021, and the yellow sections are new projects available after 2021. And as you can see, there is still quite a lot of projects being created and new versions being released, comparing that to available versions before 2021. And that's in the JavaScript space, the Python space, and the .NET space. So this is really, really not slowing down in the slightest. And that's a good thing. We all want that to, we all like free code. We all want to help each other out. We don't want to do work if the work's already been done for us by someone else. But again, like I mentioned, it is very, very expensive. Now, why do we do this? We do this because this is kind of one of the core principles that Brian and Jason wanted to do when they created Maven. They wanted to make life easier for developers. They wanted us to share more open source code with each other. And yes, it is expensive, but we just kind of keep it. Yes, it's just part of our business. We do it for the community, and we love open source. And without open source, Sonatype, wouldn't be where it is. So it's really just a thing we kind of do to give back to the community, to follow the core principles that Brian and Jason had in mind when they helped create Maven. But there is unfortunately something that costs a little bit more than than running all the hardware for Maven Central, and that is the security of your application. This is a very, very big cost, and it is becoming a bigger and more increasing cost as time goes by. So what do I mean by that? Well, first of all, let's talk about Maven Central, what Maven Central does around this area. So Maven Central has a few layers of protection. The first is quite simple. It's to prove that you own the domain of a dependency you're trying to put a new version of, etc. Now, there's sneaky little ways that hackers are getting around this. So take this, for example. If you can spot what's wrong on these 3 lines. Well, the first one, if you haven't spotted it, is they put a version number so high that most people, I'm not saying you should be doing this, you shouldn't be pulling down the latest dependency. You should be making sure the dependency you're pulling down is the one you want. It's, hasn't got vulnerabilities, etc., etc. I'll talk a bit about that later. But as you can see here, they own that domain. So they can put in a version number super, super, super high. By the way, this is only people that own that domain. And a lot of people that are saying, I want the latest version of this dependency, will pull that down. So that is one way you can get malware into people's organizations, and that's called dependency confusion. Now, the second one, if you've spotted the error here, it says log J4 rather than log 4J. Again, the reason that's called typo squatting is basically if you're a developer, accidentally make a small mistake, and I definitely have swapped characters around by accident before. They're hoping that then you'll go and pull that dependency, and next thing you know, you've got a vulnerability in your system. And if you can see that, see the last one, of course, Apache spelt wrong. Also, it's known as type squatting, as you can see here. Now, with domain ownership, the first 2 are defeated because you own the domain. So nobody can come and just add a new dependency with a stupid high version unless they own the domain. So they can't do that. And again, same with here, you own the domain, so no one can come in and go and put a log J4 kind of dependency in there. But this is allowed. Someone can make this domain themselves and put whatever they want in there. So you've got to be very careful, because proof of domain ownership will not fix this. It'll only fix the first 2. And this is a big, big problem we're having. So I would say, if you want to be scared a little bit, go and Google this, but Python and JavaScript don't have the same domain ownership protection that Java does. Now, luckily in 1999, or I think around that time, Java decided to use this way of naming stuff, which was really good because it helped us in a lot of ways. But like I mentioned, Python and JavaScript don't have this, so they're having a lot of problems now with people creating these kind of stuff now. And even bots are out there, automated bots now, which are constantly scanning these registries, these repositories, to see where they can automatically fit in some vulnerabilities that a developer won't realize that they've made this tiny mistake, and then they could have compromised their whole organization. What about all the other security? Well, everything else, to be honest, is quite difficult to manage. For example, does the new package contain vulnerabilities? How does Maven Central figure that out? Do you stop that code being published then? Does the new package contain active malware? How do, again, Maven Central figure that out? And do you stop that code being published? And how do you make sure consumers know what they're getting? Right, so Sonatype scans everything that's uploaded with its commercial scanners, but only malware is rejected. And that's really because vulnerabilities are not always black and white. For example, there might be a class that has a vulnerability in, but a lot of organizations never use that class, so they don't care about that vulnerability. And we can't really just say no to people, you know, putting these dependencies on. So this is where you kind of need to think about stuff. Now, this is when it's kind of up to us as the developers or the consumers of this stuff to figure out what's good and what's bad. I do apologize if my dog comes storming in a second, because I think it's her dinner time. She likes to knock the door down. But yeah, this is your first part of your homework. So if hopefully you are using some kind of scanning tools, and if you are using scanning tools, I want you to go and question how they work, and not just just trust in them, because scanning tools work in different ways. So I want you to question, I want to go and question, if you do have scanning tools, as to how they work and why they're coming up with these answers, because that is fundamental. Trust is a fundamental thing in this space, and if you don't trust your scanning tools, then again you're opening yourself to attack, especially if they're not, you know, reporting on the latest and greatest vulnerabilities that are coming. And another thing is, we don't want to hold people back. You know, there could be, for example, a really bad vulnerability out there, and a organization's like, wow, we need to fix this really quick. So they get an update of fixing. Now that fix might have, you know, some more minor vulnerabilities in it, but who are we to say no, we're not gonna put that into Maven Central, because then it's going to hold back other people getting the other fix they really desperately need. So we try and stay away from that as much as possible. And again, only malware is really what we try and stop. That's changed a lot at the moment. Malware isn't really the problem it is anymore, and the reason for that is it's quite easy to spot these days. So malware isn't really in a lot of the Java dependencies, and there shouldn't be any in Maven Central. But again, so this is kind of some of the extra things we're trying to build on top of Maven Central, is to give you more insight into what you're downloading, what you're consuming, if it's a good thing or not. And again, accuracy really does depend on your scanning tools, the skills of the research team behind them, and the skills of the bad guys. I mean, data is only as good as the tool that you're using. You know, the data, the tool is only as good as the data you're using at the many of the times. And yes, like I said, we're trying to put these insights into Maven Central. Now, unfortunately, I'm not saying it's anyone on this at this event, but of course, unfortunately, us as developers are a little bit slow to change. And what I've noticed is well, not just developers, humans in general, we're a very reactive race rather than a proactive race. Unfortunately, that's not the best thing for us in a lot of circumstances. So we basically have been monitoring, and of course, because Sonatype are running, oh, sorry, I don't know what my VPN just started to authenticate. Yeah, so we've been monitoring a panic that happened. Yep. We've been monitoring the log4j downloads because we run Maven Central, and as you can see, I think that's in the last 24 hours, 33% of the log4j downloads were including that major vulnerability in the last 24 hours. So 33% of organizations, developers, or whatever are still pulling down that horrible, vulnerable log4j dependency. If you can look over time since it started, it was 38% of all downloads, and at that point we were at about 51 million downloads of log4j. Now, so that was in, when was that? May. So that was in May. So now we're at 128 million downloads of it. Now we have made improvements, as you can see. Only a quarter of developers that are pulling this stuff down are now pulling down bad versions. But so there's progress there. There is progress, which is good, but we're still seeing a humongous amount of people pulling down this vulnerable dependency, which is not good. And if we can look from the beginning, so since this has started, still 34% of that 128 million downloads were ones with the vulnerability, and so that's not good. But here's a graph next, which kind of shows you how much of reactive race we are rather than a proactive race. So here's just some sample countries we have here, and as you can see, Thailand had one of the worst downloads of the vulnerable dependency packages. Now, I don't know if many people can remember, but not Thailand, sorry, Taiwan. Now, Taiwan over the summer got hacked like incredibly bad. Their infrastructure was taken down, their factories were hacked, everyone was. And as you can see, as being humans, we're a reactive race, and now they have one of the lowest amounts of log4j vulnerabilities in their organizations. And what we're trying to at Sonatype get into the mindset of people is, don't wait for bad things to happen. You need to be proactive now to stop the bad things ever happening. Because unfortunately, the bad guys have evolved. They're not the same that they were before. I'd say 20 years ago, a lot of bad guys, they were really just there to, they were really just there to basically make money. But that's not the case anymore. The bad guys are now, their aim is to basically, they're not doing this for profit. They're doing this for, say, their country or their nationality. For example, I was at a conference recently. I was on the plane to Germany with another security expert, and he messaged me about 20 minutes later saying, I'm stuck on the trains. They're now operating at 25% speed because someone's hacked the whole train network in Germany. I'm just like, what? And people aren't doing this nowadays for money. They're doing these are state-sponsored hacks. They're going after our infrastructure, they're going after our economy, our food sources. So how food gets from one place to the other. These are things that hackers are trying to attack these days, and they really want to try and do the most damage possible. They're not even these blunt attacks that they used to be, where they wait for a vulnerability and exploit it. They're now gaining access to our systems, and they're staying quiet and only doing very small things. So, okay, today they'll send two trucks to the wrong location, or today they'll delete, a little bit of user data. So they're not identified and they're not kicked out of the system, but just enough to cause, financial damage and a bit of havoc. And that's what they're doing these days. So we've got to be very, very careful. And this is, like I said, this isn't just rogue nations doing it. This is pretty much every nation in the world is now hacking each other. It's a bit of a scary prospect, really. And the field of battle has completely changed. So I talked earlier a little bit about typo squatting and dependency confusion. And I've just talked a little bit about vulnerability exploitation. So that's kind of the way we normally, like for log4j, for example, that's what hackers were doing. They're sitting there, they wait, this vulnerability gets announced, and they're in. They go and hack as much as they can. So that was kind of traditionally how they used to do things. Now they're getting even more bold, let's say. They're now going after vulnerability researchers, and there has been cases of hackers paying vulnerability researchers large amounts of money to basically to not identify a vulnerability, just so the hackers can get in. So they're really starting to get more and more bold in terms of how they're doing this. They're compromising our build systems, for example. They love compromising build systems now because they can sneak in some packages or in some stuff at the end of our build that gets straight into production, which we don't see. They're compromising our tools these days. And one of the biggest things that I try and talk about a lot nowadays is open source project compromise. So what is open source project compromise? Well, basically, they will pretend that they are a dedicated open source enthusiast. They are saying they are, they want to help the project. They want to add in this new functionality. They're committing, and it may not happen straight away. It may be weeks. It could be months. It could even be a year. But some of these hackers are now getting so clever that they're pretending to be part of these projects for a year and then slowly sneaking in vulnerabilities into these projects once they've gained the trust of everyone. So just because it's open source and it's built by the community doesn't mean that there isn't some bad actors in there trying to compromise your systems. And this is where Maven Central is essentially evolving. It's evolving to give you more insight and better defenses against these bad actors. So we can stop this stuff happening before it even gets into our organization. So this is kind of a new look and feel for Maven Central. Now, when I've used Maven Central for years, and I didn't actually realize until I joined Sonatype that they've actually revamped the whole website, so it doesn't look like it was built in the 90s like it used to. And again, they're now revamping it again, but more on the kind of, not the visual side, but more on the kind of security side. So add in sign in, for example, for publishers and enhanced metadata. I think they're doing stuff like two-factor authentication, things like that, just to try and, you know, do as much as they can to improve the security of Maven Central. More things that they're trying to add in, things like SBOM support. So if you haven't heard of an SBOM, software bill of materials, basically a thing that tells you exactly what is in your application, so you can make better decisions about what should and shouldn't be in there. SIG store support. So I know you can do this anyway, but we kind of just want to build it for you, so it just works out the box. And so we want to have cross-industry best practices. Now, the Linux Foundation, etc., lots of different organizations are now coming together to create kind of security foundations to look at this and figure out what are best practices for developers, for supply chains, for dependency management, for open source systems. All these kind of things are now being, you know, looked at with a magnifying glass because they're becoming more and more of a problem. Now, there was an extra little section which we call Enhanced Developer Intelligence, which is basically where we want your input. We want to know what it is that you as a developer that's consuming this open source projects and this code, we want to know what it is that you want to see. What will help you make the right decision to pick the right library to use the right project. So again, do reach out to me or basically any of the advocates or anything at Sonatype. My information is at the end of this presentation. Just to give, if you do have any insight or any input that you want to give us, because this is an open source thing and we do want to make it you know, as user friendly as possible. We want to give people the insight to make the right choices. So there's lots of things coming out. So again, vulnerability scanning, there's lots of ways you can do this. So we're trying to figure out the best ways to do this for Maven Central. Things you can look at, for example, documentation. You can give it a score of how good the documentation is. So this isn't just about vulnerabilities. This is the kind of the whole general quality of a project or an open source dependency. So again, documentation, licenses, if there's any weird stuff in their licensing, are they following best coding practices, or how they're releasing, for example. Security, obviously, like I've mentioned, very, very important. What vulnerabilities are in there, and are there any legal implications with this library? So trying to figure out a scoring for this is quite difficult. But there are lots of tools out there that can help you as developers as well. Sonatype has this great thing called Bomb Doctor, and they've kind of gamified it a little bit, so it's quite cool. But basically, it allows you to pick an open source project, and essentially, it will tell you what's in. It'll basically generate an SBOM for you, and then it can look at that SBOM and tell you kind of what's the word I want to use here. The health, let's say, of each of those projects, and it rates them out with this kind of system, documentation, license, best practices, etc. And tools like that can be used to help us make better decisions. But again, we're trying to get as much of this stuff into Maven Central as possible. And the great thing about having Maven Central and looking after it is we have a wealth of data here, and we can use this data to kind of figure out what's bad and what's good. So this graph here, this diagram is a herd model diagram. And what we really use this for is to see, okay, I think this is Spring actually, which we've modeled here. But for example, I am going to pick version 3.1 of something. And as a user, we can see that this person has downloaded 3.1. Okay, but they usually stay on a version for a month, 2 months, but they've instantly gone either to 3.2 or back to 3 within a day or a few days. Now, if a lot of people are doing that, there must be a reason why people are either going back a version or jumping off that version as quick as possible. And that could be anything, you know, that could be it has a breaking change in their code and stuff. These are things that we're still trying to report on the health of new dependencies. It can have a breaking change. They could have discovered a horrible vulnerability in there, etc. So this data and these graphs kind of give us a bit of insight into finding these bad dependencies, etc. and kind of, you know, looking at them and giving them a score. And again, all this stuff gives us insight, which is cool. So there is, I should have gone the other way around, so pretend this is the slide first. So Sonatype produced this really great report. We do it every year, and it's called State of the Software Supply Chain. And essentially what it talks about is it basically looks at the supply chain, the security the vulnerability and security implications of it, and how we could be doing better. Basically, just looking at the landscape of open source, how it's changed, how we're consuming, or if we're consuming more, how we're consuming it, and just generally any worries or anything that's emerging from the industry. And there's lots of different things that come out of this. For example, 8 rules for upgrading to the optimal version. Don't choose an alpha, beta, blah blah blah. So things like this are things we've managed to bring out of this report to get some kind of insight into basically things you can do to avoid any of these problems. Now, everybody, it's time for your final bit of homework. This one's a nice and easy bit. We don't have a logo for Maven Central. Maven Central for me was this logo here, but that was actually the old Sonatype logo. So there isn't specifically a logo for Maven Central. So I want you all to have a little think, get your creative juices flowing. And if you do have any great ideas for a logo for Maven Central, please do reach out to me. Not only just the logo, like I mentioned, your other homework. The first one was to look through your tools and question the decisions they make and figure out why, because that is very important for trust. The second, I want you to all hopefully try and think of a cool new logo for Maven Central. And thirdly, like I said, we want to give you insight into what you're pulling down and what you're using. So if there's anything you as a developer think, oh, do you know what? I'd like to know that bit of information, or I'd like to know that. Do reach out to me or anyone on the Sonatype team, and we can pass that on to the developers that are working on this. Yes, there is a big backlog, and yes, it is something we do for free, so be patient, but it is stuff we are working on, and we're working on quite a lot and quite hard. So if you do have anything like that, do reach out to me, either on LinkedIn or Twitter. Although Twitter just seems to be all posts about Elon Musk these days. But do reach out to me on either of those social media platforms, and I can either, if you've got any questions, I can either answer them, find the right people to answer them, or pass any feedback on to our development and engineering teams. And I've gone a little bit quick today, which makes me wonder if I've missed anything. But it is the evening, and I presume you are not going to complain about me finishing a bit earlier. So with that, I'm going to go to the Q&A. Does anyone have any questions for me in regards to anything I've talked about today? I believe you can just come off mute or just put something in the chat.
Hi, Jamie. I do have a question. I found something. You mentioned something interesting when you showed all these versions, and you said these are Spring versions. It kind of looked like it because it ended at 5.3.
Yes.
You said we can see when the user goes from version 3.2, for instance, to 3.1 or 3.0 back.
Yes.
Now, that doesn't mean that you can actually trace individual developers, because behind an IP address, there could be, thousands of developers behind an IP address. So what do you mean when you see we can see developers going back to like a 3.0 version or moving to a future version?
That is a very good question, and I'm going to possibly say I don't really have the answer for that. That is, I'm going to blame on the fact I've only been here a month. How they're getting that? So I know we definitely don't track individuals, and I know we don't track IP addresses. Yeah, so how they are figuring out which organization downloads which, I am not 100% sure, but that is an amazing question. So I'm going to write that down. And if you have some contact information, I would love to give you the answer to that question. I'll have to, it's basically our security analytics team that do all this research. So how we know what individual? But yeah, sorry, I couldn't answer your question. That is a very good question, though.
I just posted my email address into the chat window. So
awesome. Thank you very much. and I'll put that under the question, and then I will have an answer for you tomorrow.
No, it doesn't have to be tomorrow.
No, it's fine. There's honestly a really good question. I should definitely know the answer to that. To be honest, that graph for me, every time I come to, when I put that in the slide, I looked at that graph and went, "Oh, that's not a nice graph to read." But yeah, I will get.
It was,
yeah, it's not the nicest.
Barely legible with the tiny fonts and stuff. Yeah.
But yeah, I'll find out an answer to that, and I'll get back to you.
Yeah. In related. A related question. Obviously, for instance, you have, or what not obviously, from what I looked from the graph that you showed, it looked like you've got detailed version information, how often, let's say, Spring framework versions are being accessed. Now, I'm particularly interested in how popular certain technologies are in the Java space. And to say there is little information would be overstating it. There just barely isn't any information, right? So for instance, we don't even know how many people use Spring Boot versus Quarkus versus something else, right? All we have is, developer service twice a year, and that's it. Now, Maven obviously has information about, how often is, let's say, Quarkus or Spring Boot being downloaded, but I don't think that's made available in any shape or form.
I don't think it is, unfortunately.
Yeah. So is there an option to say, hey, we're for some stuff, like Java frameworks, maybe, sorry, one step back. There's a couple of things that you need when you do a new project. For instance, a database, and you need the backend framework, right? And so both of those you could use in a way by seeing, how often is something being downloaded from Maven, which would be the backend framework, and a JDBC driver, for instance, right? Not the absolute numbers are really interesting, but really in relationship. So for instance, what's the difference between, let's say, Spring Boot and Quarkus, and which way is it going, right? Is the distance getting shorter, or is the distance getting bigger, right? So that's the kind of information I look for. And nobody, a number of people have that information, but nobody is sharing it. So here I am pleading with you, a way that Maven Central could selectively share some of that information, so that we actually know, so that people can make better decisions, based on that popularity.
So I think some of that information is included in the state of the software supply chain report that I mentioned earlier. In regards to detailed things about specific technologies, I'm not sure it's something we share. I can ask if it is something that we are willing to share, but I don't know the answer to that without asking. So let me get back to you on those two questions you asked me. The simple answer is go and buy Sonatype when you get Maven Central. And that is obviously a worry, of course. Hopefully it will never happen. We don't want, a big company to come and buy us just to monetize Maven Central and to steal all the data, because, we're actually doing responsible things with it, trying to find vulnerabilities rather than, selling that data, etc. But if it could help provide insights into the most used technologies, etc. What technology is being used with certain technologies, then let me find out, and I will get back to you in an email. Is that all right?
Thank you. Yeah,
no worries. Right, got some other questions. Two questions. What on earth did we do before Maven Central? I don't know, because I wasn't a software engineer at that time. What would we do before Maven Central? I suppose we wrote everything ourselves to the point. I did have a talk not long ago about, I say not long ago, it's about 4 years ago now. It's the history of open source. And it was simply passing floppy disks, CDs around, things like that. That's pretty much how we did it back then, I guess. Thank you for Brian and Jason for creating Maven, because that's all I've been accustomed to since I've been developing. The second question, what best practices would you recommend developers adopt to reduce the load on Maven Central? Oh, that's a good question. Caching is a good one. So try and use caching as much as possible. Don't do Maven clean builds all the time, things like that. Because if you've already got the same version dependency in your local cache, you shouldn't need to be pulling it down every time. So things like trying to use your cache as much as possible, I think, would be a good starting point to try and reduce the load on Maven, because it is, to run Maven, it is millions and millions a year. Maven Central. It's one of the first questions I asked when I joined Sonatype. How much does this thing cost to run? They were like, you don't want to know. So yeah, things like that. So trying to not pull stuff down unnecessarily. Other good practices. Yeah, make sure you're using the right version. Don't always use latest. That's, you can generally pull stuff in with lots of vulnerabilities or breaking changes, etc. So things like that are good, generally, to help reduce the load or the burden on Sonatype. So thank you for that. Very good question. I'm going to copy some of these questions because they're very good. Hi, are there any good resources for students to get started with Maven? Are there any official training materials? There's a few things on the Sonatype website about Maven. Honestly, in terms of Maven, just start Googling it. There is loads of things out there. I probably shouldn't be, well, that's fine, it's open source. So my old product, I used to work on Open Liberty. We have some stuff on Maven. Okay, so this is with obviously a specific runtime, but it should work. It should be fine. It should, the guide should work for different runtimes. I just put it in the chat. Oh no, I didn't include the Maven part. 1 second. So yeah, if you go to the second URL, that all lists the specific Maven guides we have on the Open Liberty site. I haven't had time to go through all the Sonatype materials, so I don't know what they have. But yeah, have a look through there, because then it'll teach you some best practices to get started with Maven. And again, the internet is your best friend here. There's a lot, like Quarkus will have some guides on how to do Maven. So it really matters. It depends on what you want to do. What I would say, if you're getting started, is generally look at best practices, because it's very easy to go down a rabbit hole, let's say, and to start creating a Maven POM. And when it's not too big, yes, it may work, but it might be clunky if you're not using variables in the right places and things like that, and hard code and everything. Yes, it can be a bit clunky, but then when you actually have to expand it and use it for lots of things, or doing like a multi-module application, that's when it can get really confusing. So I would say, to get started with, have a look online for best practices with writing Maven POM files or Maven, and then when you figure out what you really want to do with Maven, then you can start Googling specific technologies. And like I said, so Open Liberty, I know Quarkus, most of the different runtimes, etc., will all have stuff to do with Maven and how to get started with it. So hopefully you'll be able to find all that stuff there. Okay, next question. There are tools like the Cyclone Maven plugin for generating SBOMs. Yes, there is, which is a really good plugin, actually. When the artifacts from those type of tools are generated, are they generating satisfactory content? Do they get audited by Sonatype, Bomb Doctor, etc.? So the SBOM, so the Cyclone DX Maven plugin just produces an SBOM. That SBOM doesn't tell you what's vulnerable. It doesn't tell you, it basically just tells you what's there. It's like saying, here's your stuff. Now you have to decide if it's good or not. So that is when you need to use other tools to decide if they're good and if they're not. So that's what Bomb Doctor is doing. Bomb Doctor is basically looking at a project. It's then basically doing the job of the Cyclone DX Maven plugin. I think the SBOM it produces might be a Cyclone DX one. I'm not sure. There's like 2 or 3 main standards. I'm pretty sure we support all of them. But it'll basically produce an SBOM for you. And then from that SBOM, then Sonatype's doing its magic on top, and using the data and the intelligence we have. I mean, we have a security team of like 70 people that are constantly looking at this stuff. For example, Nexus Firewall, if something comes in and we don't know that it's a healthy package, within 10 minutes, that goes to our research team, who then do the research, and within about 15-20 minutes, they will get back to you and say, this is good or bad. So it really, at that point, it comes down to trusting an organization or a tool to basically look at what you've got and provide you with, usable data back. It's not just vulnerabilities as well. I mean, we can have issues with licensing, all kinds of things. So we have to be careful of what we're doing. So really, that plugin is good. It's a good starting point because it'll generate the SBOM for us, but it's up to us what we do with that SBOM. So again, we have to feed that into another tool. Or, I mean, you can do it manually, but I wouldn't want to do that. But you can feed it into another tool. And the problem is nowadays, you've got a dependency. And that dependency, a lot of tools don't do this, and be careful of this. This is why I say question the tool you're using, because you could have a dependency, and this dependency, say we've got a scale of 5 for vulnerability. Say it only has and 5 being the worst. It's only got a number 2 vulnerability in. So, that's okay. We can use that dependency. It's not, it's not that bad. But that could then depend on another dependency that had a level 5 vulnerability in it. And a lot of tools don't go down those levels, and they are level after level after level after level. So do be careful the tools you're using, because some are more accurate than others. And that's why I said your homework is to go and check your tools if you are using them and question their results. Hopefully that answered your question there. Jonathan said, downloaded jars from SourceForge and fiddled about with the ant files. Answer to what did we do before Maven Central? Yes. Yeah, ants, of course. I have used ant before, actually. I'm not that young. I have used ant before. Okay, so we're nearly out of time. We've got about 9 minutes left. But again, we're not supposed to use the whole hour. Is there any other questions before I finish off? Abby, unfortunately, is not feeling very well, so I'm going to close the session today. Silence suggests that I've answered all your questions. I will get back to you on those other questions I couldn't answer. I have put them down, I've highlighted them in bold, and I've got your email address, so I will figure out what those answers are tomorrow and talk to the right people. To be honest, it's just one person I need to talk to, but he's based in the UK and he's probably not online anymore. Awesome. It looks like you all enjoyed the talk, so thank you. Oh, by the way, the LJC are doing an unconference. Unfortunately, I'm on vacation, which is really, really annoying, but if you've never attended one of their unconferences before, they are great. I'm pretty sure they're doing it in the new IBM offices. So even if just go, I haven't even got to check them out, so go and check them out. They're absolutely amazing. They're on York Road, next to the London Eye. And yeah, the LJC is doing an unconference there, and it was one of, I think it's the first and only unconference I've ever done, and this was 6-7 years ago now, and it was one of the first events I ever attended as a developer. So do go check it out. It's an amazing event. And yeah, I just want to say thank you to you all for joining me today. It's been an absolute pleasure. And yes, thank you for all the really good questions. And again, 3 pieces of homework. Figure out what you would want to see, what insights you want to see. Figure out, we need a new image for Maven Central. So if you've got one of those, send that over to us. And the first one was to go and question any tools you have that are telling you something's safe and something's not, just so you have the insight and you can then trust said tool to keep you protected. Awesome. Well, thank you, everybody. Enjoy the rest of your evening. Hopefully I can come and speak to you all soon at another evening event. But yeah, with that, I will end the session. Thank you all.